to everybody who's joining us. Before we actually get started, I just wanted to point out to anybody who's joining us who knows Richard from before, this is going to be a great episode, mainly because this is our first time having a German historian, but not our first time having a historian of religion. But it is our first time having a historian of Nazis, which is very weird because one would think a webcast that began in like the depth of the pandemic, as well as in the depth of the previous administration, as well as in the depth of like the global situation, we would have Nazis and, you know, fascism scholars on sooner, but we just kept putting it off because I think people online were just sort of really sick of it. I think that's going to be one of the questions I ask you about is what is going on with the online discussion of this? Because as soon as anybody mentions the F word, it's like, it's worse than the actual F word. It's worse than actually saying fuck.
Well, you can always block people on Twitter. I mean, I've been blocked on Twitter and I've blocked on Twitter. So
yeah, that's how I do it, especially with debates like this. But yeah, we can just get started. So if people don't know, this is Drinking with Historians. And today we're very lucky to have Richard Steigman-Gall, who's an associate professor of history at Kent State University. And he also was the director of the Jewish Studies program. He got his bachelor's and master's from University of Michigan, and then he got his PhD from University of Toronto. His first book, which he was just telling us, he just hit it out of the park with. It was just so good. Got translated into a bunch of languages. The Holy Reich, Nazi Conceptions of Christianity, 1919 to 1945. But what people who are joining us might know him for, or at least what I know him for, and the reason I think he's sort of a rock star, which is pretty cool, is this article he published in 2017 called Star-spangled Fascism, American Interwar Political Extremism in Comparative Perspective. Basically, it tries to understand what American fascism could look like, what it does look like, why we should be studying it, why it's a useful term. It's a great article. And then besides that, he's written a lot about, you know, religion and Nazism. So if you guys have questions for the second half, make sure to put it in the Q&A. But yeah, that's Richard. Did I miss anything, Richard?
I think not. Thank you for that very fulsome introduction, Varsha. That's very kind of you. Do we begin by saying if we're having a drink in this Drinking with Historians?
Yes, please do. That is the most important question of Drinking with Historians. So what have you got tonight? So
I've got, this is quite apropos given the topic, so I'm sorry that my background is obscuring the drink, but this is a suffering bastard. Not kidding.
Nice.
It's made with, gin and brandy, Angostura bitters, lime juice, and it's topped off with ginger beer. And it was made just around World War II for veterans who had come back from battle. So the Suffering Bastard is a rather salty World War II name.
It's a very Hemingway drink.
It is. I'm not sure about the cravat. The cravat might be a little Hemingway, might be way beyond that. I don't know. So, but thank you for abiding that. I'm sort of doing the country squire thing, as you can see here. Not really my vibe, but why not, right?
Yeah.
A little bit of flair. A little bit of flair for men, I think, is a good thing these days. We should do it.
It is. Yeah. What are you drinking, Rachel?
I am drinking a gin fizz, which I thought sort of matched my outfit and the tenor for tonight. But thank you for the information about the Suffering Bastard. I had that for the first time years ago in Chinatown in Philadelphia and had no idea why it was called that, unless that was how you felt after you drank it. I wasn't entirely sure.
It was kind of the Bloody Mary of its day, too. It was supposed to help through your morning, right?
And what are you drinking, Varsha?
Yeah.
I am drinking a new scotch to me. I don't know how to pronounce it, so Scottish people, you can tell me. It's the Oshintoshan. It's just a really like chocolatey, fruity scotch. It's like really sweet, but it still has a kick to it. I bought it without trying it because the person at the liquor store that I frequent, who's like actually nice to me, even though I'm like a lady buying whiskey, was like, you should try this, and I did, and it's really, really good.
You have a glass. I was afraid you were just going to be drinking it right from the
No. I have a glass, but yeah, I was going to drink bourbon because I just came from a weekend in Kentucky. It was the best weekend of my life. I tried 15 different bourbons. I got to go to 3 different distilleries, but the thing is, you're not allowed to ship bourbon from Kentucky to California. There's like a bunch of states you're not allowed to ship alcohol to. It's a really stupid law. I don't know why it exists, but it's incredibly dumb. And I didn't have a checked bag with me. So I didn't really want to put liquor in a checked bag and like break the law. And even if I did, what if the bottle cracked inside? So I was like, no, I won't drink bourbon today. I'll drink scotch. I've had enough bourbon. But yeah, it was.
That is a silly law, though.
It is a silly law. There's a lot of silly laws, and like recently, I was recently ranking the amendments, the U.S. Constitution amendments, and I think the amendment to reverse prohibition is the coolest amendment. I used to think it's, you know, the giving right to women to vote, but no, I think it's the reversing prohibition. Yeah, I would start with that because it is interwar stuff, but I think I'd like to start with one of the most interesting questions that I have, because whenever I studied Nazi Germany in high school, in college, when I took European history classes, even when I got to grad school and I had to take European history classes, I just never studied religion and the intersection of Nazi Germany. So how did you decide you would be studying religion in the midst of Nazi Germany? Why did you decide that?
Yeah, so I mean, I can cop to my biography as a starting point. You know, we all sort of come to history, at least many of us do, through some sort of personal experience or family connection, either categorically or in terms of the actual events that were lived through. And my dad lived through Nazi Germany. So he was born in 1931 in Heidelberg of a Jewish mother and a Gentile father. And it was his Gentile father's idea to get the heck out of Germany very quickly in 1933 already. Whereas, not unsurprisingly, if you know the history, for his Jewish mother, Hitler just seemed like another demagogue who would deflate like a balloon in a couple of years. Oh, let's, you know, this is our country. Why should we leave? Let's hang tight. You know, we're Jews. We've dealt with this kind of thing for thousands of years. So they left, first for Luxembourg, and then again, his dad was quite prescient and said, we got to get out of Luxembourg. So they then ended up in England in World War II. My dad told incredibly vivid stories about his war experience in World War II, he lived in Bath, the famous 18th century Georgian spa town. The house was bombed, or there was a cannon fire that destroyed the house that they were living in. And, you know, he was in the reinforced cellar when the house came crashing down 5 minutes after his dad grabbed him out of his bedroom and said, we have to rush down to the cellar. So these kinds of things really fascinated me. Ironically, my dad then wanted me to go into the sciences or be an engineer. And when I finally got, you know, what I wanted out of my own life and became an historian, I was always able to say, well, it's your fault for telling me those fascinating stories. So in a broader sense, guys, that's where my interest in the topic comes from. More precisely and arguably intellectually, I was always struck by this question of anti-Semitism. My dad's experiences had me fascinated in the question of Nazi anti-Semitism. And the weird thing for me was that there was this tension in the scholarship. There would be all these books on how it is that the Nazis were always apparently so anti-Christian, anti-clerical, going after priests and pastors, seemingly as much as other outgroups.
What I thought, yeah.
Yeah, right. And that's what one always hears, right? Bonhoeffer and Niemöller as particular martyrs to Nazism always come to mind. But then on the other hand, I was also reading about how, you know, at least among certain scholars of anti-Semitism in Nazi Germany, there was a Christian sort of connection to Nazi anti-Semitism, that in other words, the antecedents to Nazi anti-Semitism, if you really look back over the centuries, and of course, plenty of historians don't, they think there's a sharp break even now, some of them. There was this argument amongst other scholars that no, there's a Christian connection, right? Even as the Nazis were allegedly being really anti-Christian in these ways, they were sort of continuing on certain legacies or traditions of Christianity in other ways. So that struck me as a tension that wasn't really being reconciled in the scholarship. And so I asked myself, okay, why doesn't somebody actually look at what leadership in the Nazi party, not just Hitler, but, you know, the other sort of elite cadre of the Nazi party had to say about what the Nazi conception of Christianity actually was. So that got me launched on this project.
It's really fascinating. And I noticed that you use the term positive Christianity, which as someone who was raised in America as a Protestant from a very devout evangelical family, that I didn't think it was what it was. So could you explain it to people like me who may not get the term?
So positive Christianity in scholarship on 19th century German theology means something quite different than what the Nazis meant. They said positivus Christentum. So this was one of the things that struck me, right? The Nazis kept referring to how they believe in a positive Christianity that upholds both Catholics and Protestants in Germany. And so it was very ill-defined when I started looking to see how, what exactly they meant by this. It wasn't clear. So I started investigating any tract I could find where the Nazis referred to positive Christianity. And what they basically meant about it, by it rather, was something that they viewed, if not as not quite ecumenical, but not quite a blend of religions either. It was meant to be something that would be not particularly interested in theology, but would rally what they saw as a divided people, Protestants and Catholics in Germany, who had been arguably divided since the unification of Germany over the issue of the so-called Kulturkampf, the struggle of civilizations, right, where Catholics were immediately made to feel like they were second-class citizens in this new nation of Germany. And so positive Christianity was more explicitly about an ethos. We're going to bring back an ethos that has Protestants and Catholics seeing their commonalities, especially since it's the Jew who divides Protestants and Catholics, right? In the Nazi mindset, the Jew who hates Christ and hates all Christians benefits in the Nazi scheme of things. This was what was said, right? That it's at the benefit of the Jew that Protestant and Catholic in Germany should be divided politically, and we Nazis were going to merge them together politically. So the Nazis spoke a lot about this positivus Christentum in an explicitly political framework because they wanted Catholics to vote for the party, right? An accident from some people's point of view that Hitler was nominally Catholic. Goebbels was nominally Catholic, Himmler, Heydrich, right? You've got a lot of top tier Nazis who were Catholic in a country that had very few Catholic heads of, not just presidents, pardon me, there was no Catholic president of Germany, but the chancellors, right? The prime ministers of Germany, very few of them had been Catholic before. So they'd always been nominally Protestant. So the ways in which the Nazis sought to sort of rise above the confessional divide ended up really being what their positive Christianity was about. It was not an attempt to create some sort of syncretic new theology. When you look at German religious history, the Protestant Church of Prussia was arguably such a syncretic church. It blended Lutheranism and Calvinism in what was called a union church. So the Prussian state church was a union church, meaning it was sort of an attempt to blend syncretically Lutheranism and Calvinism. Why? Because the majority of Prussians were Lutheran, but the monarchs, right, the Hohenzollerns were in fact Calvinist. So it's not that kind of thing. Positive Christianity in Nazi mindset is not an attempt to lay out a new theology.
One thing I'm interested in is that in the United States, for example, there's examples of like, religious demagogues who, use religion to have a sort of like Americanism or extremism for them, right? Like people like Father Charles Coughlin. When it comes to the Nazis, people like Hitler, or even, maybe not after Hitler, but people under Hitler, was Catholicism really important to Nazism? Is it really important to fascism? I know those are two different questions, but is religion central to the German Nazi state or the Third Reich?
Right. So it's very much a question of how you interpret what religion is, right? So for many years after World War II, I'm not trying to prevaricate here, I'll answer your question, but by way of introducing this notion that a lot of historians after World War II looked at Nazism, alleged it was anti-Christian, and tried to explain its appeal to Germans by saying it was a replacement faith, right? A political religion, a new faith that will come along. The old wine of Christianity, the contents had been poured out of this bottle, and Hitler came along and poured new wine into this old bottle. and it was Nazism. And Nazism succeeded. So certain scholars like George Massey used to make this argument quite strongly, that Nazism succeeded because it could mimic a religion. The German had been de-Christianized owing to Nietzschean sort of death of God philosophy. Here comes Gerald. Say hi, Gerald, there you are. Always comes in at the right time. And so the Germans in this moment decided, well, we need a new faith. And Hitler was the new God, right? Hitler's the new Jesus. So a lot of scholars will tell you, yes, that explains Nazism, while also saying that Nazism was able to break through because Germans stopped being Christian. So I ended up finding the opposite, in fact, that for Germans who were drawn to Nazism in the polling booth, right? Nazi claims to defend Christianity against Bolshevism, right? Atheistic Bolshevism, against Christ-hating Judaism, the alleged hostility of Jews to Christians, right? Which again was part of the heritage going back 3 centuries of Christian anti-Semitism, where Jews had been told this. And any other number of social crises that the Nazis said they were going to solve, they were able to tell a German public, look, if you love the church, if you love Christianity, if you want to defend Christianity against these horrors that are befalling us within the country, domestically and abroad, then we're your choice. So for the Nazis, they wanted both Catholics and Protestants to hear this. So the question of Catholicism, to get back to your prior question, there's a real tension in Nazism, because on the one hand, Catholicism is an international institution. And as a nationalist party, of course, the Nazis don't like internationalism of any kind, right? The Bolsheviks are internationalists, that's why they're hated. Jews are perceived to be international. This is why they are hated by the Nazis, say the Nazis. And then in many cases, in fact, Nazi hostility to the Vatican is very strong, very strong. But they claim it's institutional only and not about religion of Christ, right? So they try to be anti-clerical while saying, actually, if you love Jesus, you don't want to vote for the center party. The Germans had a choice to make politically with the so-called Center Party, which is a party explicitly for Catholics in Germany. And they wanted to make it sound as though if you're truly concerned about the fate of Christianity in this turbulent 20th century after the Bolshevik Revolution and the collapse of World War I, then you should vote for us, right? So there was a crisis of civilization that the Nazis hoped pious Germans would see them as the solution to. Put it that way.
So before we move to the really contentious topic, which I'm sure there'll be Q&As about in the second half, I think we should have a pre-question before that.
Sure.
This is a very big question, and I apologize. What is the difference between fascism as the term as it originated in Italy versus Nazism? Is there a difference? Is it the same thing? Is Nazism a subset? Do Nazis see themselves as fascist, or are they totally different?
Yeah. Well, this was this confusion was exacerbated when last year, right? So you recall how in 2016 there was this huge welter of, it became a cottage industry for historians of fascism to weigh in, right? Does Trump qualify or not? And then again last year.
Last year, for some reason, it bubbled up again, and
it bubbled up again.
It bubbled up so much so that I was willing to write 5,000 words about it on Substack. That's how much it bubbled up.
There were very good words too. I recall wrote a very excellent article that took on some of the sacred cows, right, that some people were using to say, no, it can't be fascism. How dare you? The Soviet Union, it doesn't exist anymore. How dare you say this could be fascism? So, but that second sort of wave of scholarship last year, before the January 6th putsch, I'll call it, you saw some people say, well, it can't be fascism in this country because Hitler did this or that.
And then they said, because the putsch failed on January 6th, it's not fascism.
Yeah, right.
Also, it has to succeed to be fascism? I'm sorry, I'm getting angry.
No. I mean, the November putsch of 1923 also failed, right? And so on, Twitter wars erupted where scholars would try to ding each other with these points. I may have, gotten involved in such dinging myself, but To answer your question, Varsha, if you believe that comparative fascism is a useful category of analysis, you pretty quickly come to the conclusion that Hitler was a fascist, Mussolini and Hitler, clearly the two biggies. And then there were a bunch of movements in countries that didn't have fascist governments, at least under their own steam. If they resulted from Nazi occupation after military conquest, then that's something else, right? But they weren't autonomous. Here comes Gerald to say hello. They were autonomous in their coming to power, right, outside of Germany and Italy. But when you look at the history, when you look at what the contemporaries were saying when they saw Hitler's rise, in many cases, they called him the German Mussolini. People were calling Hitler the German Mussolini in the day. So that is already indicative, I think. So for me, I mean, there can still be scholars who say, no, he wasn't fascist. I think he was a fascist. And why would he be a fascist? Because Hitler and Mussolini both believed in what Robert Paxton calls passions, right? The leading fascist passions. One thing, the first one is that the nation is beleaguered by enemies within and without. Second, the government of the country has been corrupted by nefarious elites who don't belong there. And it is through violent means, if necessary, and certainly extra parliamentary means, that we must seize the state back for the true nation, right? So this idea that we must engage in street fighting, street violence, there's an ethos of violence, and the people in power got there through menacing ways, and they don't belong there. There's a conspiracy to undermine the nation. People inside the country are part of that conspiracy as well as external enemies, and we veterans, this is another key ingredient, right? The angry veteran who sacrificed for his country, in those days it was just his country, and will now represent the nation best, right? I, who feel most American, said the Oath Keeper on January 6th, as they were committed to storming the Congress and taking back America for the true nation, right? So the role of the veteran. Now, somebody will say, but there were plenty of people on those steps who weren't veterans, and that's a point well taken. But the ethos of violence puts the veteran who went through warfare, who sacrificed for the nation, in the center of a movement that says we must fight now. Having fought abroad, we must fight at home to keep the country from going to the dogs. There, I think you would see Hitler and Mussolini both being on the same page. And of course, an ideology of extreme nationalism that is anti-liberal as well as anti-Marxist and calls for economic autarky, right? The idea that the nation should not rely on international trade because that weakens the resolve of that weakens our backbone when we must depend on foreign imports to sustain ourselves, right? So a good fascist in the realm of economics can be a friend of capitalism, all right? A lot of people are confused with, oh, fascism is right? Fox News told me. And aren't the Nazis national socialists? Doesn't that already prove it? You see, they're leftists, right? So there are some ways in which the Nazis don't look particularly fond of laissez-faire capitalism, but they were huge fans of Henry Ford, who was a billionaire of industry. So we can elaborate on that later if you want. But the fascist economically is always an advocate of separation, right? They don't want to be interwoven with international trade. They want what's called autarky.
That's so interesting, because I feel like when I've heard the word fascist, typically in news cycles and other outlets, that it's sort of bandied about as a term of abuse rather than analysis. And so, I mean, I wonder what does American fascism look like? If we saw it, would we call it that? Would we call it nativist or the extreme right or far right or something like that?
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question. I mean, it really hits one of the great challenges for American history and the writing of American history, right? The tradition of writing American history is very adverse to using the F word, because there was a brown scare in the 1930s. well as the abuse of the word fascism, certainly in the the heyday of 1960s student radicalism, right? Mom, dad, what do you mean I can't go to Woodstock? You're a fascist, right? This kind of thing. So the abuse of the word in a particular cultural sense, as well as an actual brown scare that did exist in this country in the 1930s, makes people, scholars, very adverse to thinking about an American fascism. So much so that it's now a problem in the opposite direction. There are clearly things that are happening in this country, certainly between World Wars I and II. And of course, the big question is now, once again, in the last 5 years, 6 years, say, that merit a serious consideration. So what would it look like, Rachel, to your question? I mean, I have a chapter coming out in a volume through Cambridge University Press. Varsha happens to be in this volume as well. And it's going to be on this one particular literal shirt-wearing American fascist named William Dudley Pellet, who ran an organization called the Silver Legion, or the Silver Shirts. There have been some books now that are beginning to come out that discuss the Silver Legion or Silver Shirts, but it's still a scholarship that's quite in its infancy. So hopefully there's a lot more to come in the future. Very small organization, and that was one of the interesting things about American fascism between World Wars I and II. You have many parties, and there's no gravitational personality that really ends up blending them together, right? France is quite comparable in this way. French fascism, you see a lot of different organizations and parties between World Wars I and II, and there's no, for lack of a better word, French duce that can rally them together with their gravitational charisma. And at the end of the day, American fascism lacks such a duce or Führer figure who can weld these diffuse parties into one.
I think I have a chapter, like Richard mentioned, I have a chapter, and in my chapter, I look at the same time period as my co-author, but we're looking at the America First movement. So we're not looking at people like Pellet, who are running literal fascist organizations in between the two wars in trying to stop America from joining World War II. But this organization, the America First organization, is started by Americans, who some of them are just peace-loving isolationists, peace-loving pacifists, and others end up being people who turn out to be very, very pro-Nazi, right? Like people like Lindbergh, and people who turn out to actually end up visiting, Nazi Germany and go like, this sort of makes sense. And then they turn out to be super anti-Semitic. And then the argument my co-author and I make, we end up arguing that this is what makes it uniquely American. Just like Richard said, it's not just like Germany, Italy, France, even England, some South American countries, India, so many other countries have their own original, distinct origins for their own fascist movements, for their own nativist movements. America has a distinct origin. And I think it really does begin with the other terms that you mentioned, Rachel, like nativism, extreme right, and white supremacist. One of the questions I had to ask, Rachel also had this question, is in your article, you make an interesting comparison between the aims of the KKK as well as the aims and nature of fascism. Could you sort of expand on that? Because Richard Paxton also makes that point.
Yeah, Paxton actually, in his Anatomy of Fascism from 2004, he comes out with this this template, right? What is fascism? And at one point in the book, it's not front and center.
It's in a footnote, actually. Yeah,
you're right, almost a footnote. He says, actually, according to me, the Klan must be the world's first fascist movement, right? Already in the late 1800s. So because it matches all of these passions that he insists every fascist movement has, and also collectively only fascism has, right? So you can be an anti-Semite and not be a fascist. You can hate communism and not be a fascist. But it's the connection, Gerald is only getting more speaking here. Sorry guys for the wobbly screen, but it's the combination of these as well that makes you a fascist, right? Not just any one of those things, which other people who aren't fascist can be. So the Klan in the 20s and 30s talk about the dangers that face the white race. Of course, they're the Klan, what else are they going to say? But the ways in which they do so bear really striking resemblance to fascist movements in Europe, right? The kind of social classes they claim to defend, especially what in German is called the Mittelstand, the lower middle class, or the petty bourgeoisie in Marxist terminology, the little man who's stuck between, on the one side, big labor, and on the other side, big capital, right? So they they claim to represent the little guy who's going to be defended against these two rival threats of modernization, right? Squeezing out the artisan, squeezing out the skilled laborer, this kind of thing. So in its social base, the KKK speak to a similar kind of demographic, an agrarian demographic as well, right? Nazis finally started succeeding after 1928 by, in part, making sure they started talking to people in the countryside, right? They had been spending a lot of time concentrating on the biggest cities, and it's in the cities where the Nazis got the least traction when you look at percentage of voters. It's in Berlin where they were they failed the most, right? Whereas in the small towns and villages, they started getting a lot of people listening to them. So the fly in the ointment is, of course, the fact that in the 30s, Nazism as a foreign force looked un-American. And so you have this way in which especially Southern white racists who are all about segregation, the Nazis look at American segregation and say, hey, that's great. Let's learn from that, right? The Nazis look at American eugenics laws that are passed in several states, especially Virginia, and say, hey, let's learn from that. Let's go to the United States and take notes. So American Klansmen will oftentimes be heard to say, oh, well, Nazism's, that's pagan, right? They don't like Christianity, right? Again, this comes back. So we're not connected to that. So there's this irony that fascism is an international movement and that it occurs in more than one country, but because its ethos and its discourse is hyper-nationalist, there's a way in which the fascists must deny that they are in cahoots with fellow fascists abroad, right? So the Spanish fascist Primo de Rivera, who was undoubtedly fascist, right? Even Stanley Paxton, Stanley Payne, pardon me, who thinks that Franco wasn't a fascist, for instance, will admit that this guy was a fascist. But this guy, Primo de Rivera, famously said, I can't be fascist, I'm Spanish. So it's an odd choice, right? It's an odd either or. So there's this very curious balance that we must strike as scholars when we look at the professions of fascists in the United States or fascists in Spain or fascists in another country, to say, no, we don't imitate Germany, we don't imitate Italy, so we're not fascists in that sense. But when you look at what they care about, when you look at what they're going to die for or kill other people for, the passions are all there. They're exactly the same.
Rachel, did you have a question?
No, I was wondering if you wanted to start getting to audience questions. We have some good ones.
Yeah, so there's a really good audience question that I sort of want to add to and ask. So Dagmar asked if it's a common thread between World War I veterans, from Germany as well as other countries, getting angry in the interwar period and joining a fascist movement. Is there a common thread, or is there a comparison to be made between the veterans we've seen in the United States for the past 20, 30 years? Because recently in the news, or this week's news, is Afghanistan. This week's news is a 20-year-old war that, has ended in disaster from the beginning. This week's news is like, Biden is deeply disrespectful to the veterans, or, has no idea what he's doing, et cetera, et cetera. Well, at the same time, people who are saying that, we're also noting that Trump, as well as Obama, as well as, I don't think Bush, but like maybe last day Bush wanted to pull out of Afghanistan as well. So is there, I think it's something that Jeff Ely, who's also a fascism scholar, sort of talks about as a fascism producing crisis. He talks about, the financial crisis. He talks about our issue with our, minoritarian government. Does our issue with our veterans or our military, or basically our failure with American empire, does that play into how we can sort of understand American fascism?
There was a bit of the network failed you just at the last second there, but I think I got what you were saying anyway, Varsha. So I think there is a structural factor here. When you look comparatively at fascist movements, it's disgruntled veterans who are always in the middle of that, right? Now, war always creates veterans and always will create, to some degree, veterans who feel that they got screwed, right? that they suffered for the sake of the country. A grateful nation has cast them aside, and they feel like they've been used, they feel like they've been cheated, they feel that they went to war on a promise that they would be heralded on their return as conquering heroes, as we used to say, right? And now that promise has been stripped away, right? They've been robbed of that. So the Vietnam War, famously, right? You see these scenes of anti-war protesters spitting at veterans or flipping them the finger, or whatever it is, and the vets feel like that promise has been broken. What did the first Bush do after the Iraq War, right? The first Iraq War, he led a parade and said, "This is for you, you Vietnam vets too, because you never got a parade," right? You might recall at least reading about how Bush wanted this to be a very triumphalist movement that would give Vietnam vets a chance to get their thanks, because we didn't give them their thanks, right, that they deserved in the 70s, because that war went south. So it's a very good question. I think the one interesting difference structurally, since we're asking a structural question, right, what kind of crisis produces fascism, when Jeff Ely asks that question, it's very much meant in structural terms, right? What are the socioeconomic forces at play? One structural difference here, of course, is a professional army, right? So after World Wars I and II, it was a conscription army, and many men hated that experience, right? So famously, one veteran wrote the greatest pacifistic novel ever written, right? All Quiet on the Western Front. And he was in the trenches just like Hitler and other fascists who emerged from that trench warfare and said, "Gosh, that was great. I'd love to have that again," right? So this is a really terrifying thing when you see these depictions of the horrors of World War I warfare. You see how it is that people suffered terribly, right? Men are enduring horrible privations, and they come out of it, if you're a fascist, saying, "Boy, that was great," right? The community of the trenches, the shared sacrifice, a brotherhood of suffering. I want that again. Whereas then there were other veterans like Remarque, right? The author of All Quiet on the Western Front, who had those same experiences and said, "This is horrible. We should make sure it never happens again." So I would hate for any veteran of a war to come away tonight with the idea that they're somehow more predisposed to fascism. They may have exited that war experience deeply remorseful of what they had to endure and what they made others endure if they were, on the firing end of a gun. It might be quite pacifistic, in fact, right? So we can't just say all vets. Having said that, it's important to keep in mind that the American Legion, which was founded after World War I to represent veteran interests, actually described themselves, guys, as America's squadristi.
Oh, no.
Yeah. And they were big fans of Mussolini. They invited Mussolini to the United States to become a recipient of one of their medals. And there was a lot of comparisons that the American Legion themselves were making. We are America's squadristi. We sacrificed for the country abroad. And when we get back home, we're not going to let the Wobblies control the streets, right? We're not going to let the Reds take over. So there's a Red Scare. We know all about the Cold War Red Scare, right, in this country, 50s, 60s, 70s. But there was a Red Scare after World War I in this country too. And the American Legion said, "Yeah, we'll do what it takes to defend the true interests of the nation, even if our politicians won't." So I think when you look at the place of veterans, it's important to put it front and center. I think the Oath Keepers and the Six Percenters and these very agitationalist veterans groups who say we are the men who feel most American, and they promise violence. And for years, they didn't really deliver. And then January 6th, to a considerable degree, they did. These guys, at the core of their ethos sits the veteran. Right? Even if not everybody who stormed January 6th, the steps of Congress that day, are actual veterans. The ethos of the veteran, right, as the person who is in the middle of this, I think is really important as a point of comparison.
I'm sorry, Varsha.
I was another audience question.
Yeah, I saw something from David, who mentioned a book called Friendly Fascism, which envisioned American fascism, and he was just curious if you knew this book and if you could comment on it.
I'm glad to be advised of its existence. I am not aware of this book. I'll make sure to check it out. I mean, there's such, in fact, there's a great deal that's been written about fascism. Oftentimes, I'm not saying this book must be an example of this. I'll read it and hopefully benefit from it. So thank you for mentioning the title. But a lot of the books that come out, right, about fascism will say, this politician I don't like is fascist, right? So I can't remember the name now, but there's a book that came out some years ago called Liberal Fascism.
Oh yes, I know who you're talking about. Not a good author, not a good book.
Yeah, I mean, he's not an historian, go figure. But the first thing to know about fascism is that it detests parliamentary democracy. Any fascist will tell you, oh no, we hate liberalism. So how liberalism is fascism is, so it's being used as a slur, right? It's being used as a bogeyman. This is, the misuse of the F word. So I understand why it is that scholars are very curlish about wanting to use the F word because of its great overuse. And so a lot of books that have come out over the years will claim to unearth fascism, only to learn that it's Lyndon LaRouche or something. I'm not saying that this book is that. Thank you again, dear reader, for bringing that title to my attention. I'll take a look at it.
Yeah, I haven't read it either. And there's another question from the audience that I think I'm going to add on because it's really useful. They were asking when you were talking before you mentioned about the Catholic Church being anti-Semitic. My question to add on to that is there a difference, since you studied a little bit of American history for that article you wrote in 2017, do you think there's a big difference between German anti-Semitism in the Nazi era and American anti-Semitism? Is there a difference that you see, or are they learning from each other, or is it totally separate, right? Because in the United States, you see a lot of anti-Catholicism too.
That's true. And then on the other hand, you mentioned Father Coughlin, right?
Yeah.
A Catholic. And he was the most outrageous anti-Semitism of the whole era, and most outrageous anti-Semite. He had an audience of over 30 million. And in those days, not everybody had a radio, right? So 30 million.
It was pretty big.
90 years ago, that's a huge number, right?
He literally had to get shut down. Like the government finally shut him down, and it took a while.
Right, because he was being accused then of sedition, right? After World War II started, there were people who thought that literally he was in cahoots with foreign governments, right? So the question of Catholic versus Protestant is an important one. I very much appreciated the question about that included this reference to the Spanish Inquisition, right? Don't you see with the Spanish Inquisition a fanatical and murderous anti-Semitism? Absolutely the case. And in French anti-Semitism, there is a great deal of Catholicism that gets weaved in to the French anti-Semitic, the fascism there, right? Anti-Semitic fascism in France. Interestingly, in Italy, and I think this is really a peculiarity of Italian history that must account for this, fascism is not anti-Semitic. In Italy, fascism is not anti-Semitic until 1938, when by this point, Hitler is pretty clearly the senior partner in the Berlin axis, right? 1933, when Hitler starts running Germany, Mussolini had been a fascist leader in Italy for 11 years, right? And Hitler viewed him as a role model to be emulated. Again, Hitler being called the German Mussolini sort of indicates this. By the eve of World War II, it's clear to everybody that Hitler is now the senior partner, primarily because Germany is a much more powerful country economically, industrially, militarily than Italy is. So that you have the numbers behind you, and that makes your case. And it's then that Italy starts acquiring Nuremberg law type laws for Italy, right, forbidding marriages between Jews and Gentiles. But it came so late in Mussolini's reign and was so clearly a function. It's not that Hitler called up Mussolini and said, "Hey, you need to do this for me if we're going to stay." Hey, do me a solid. I mean, he didn't say that.
The hidden archives, Hitler and Mussolini's conversation.
Right. But no, I mean, no historian will say that Hitler, forced Mussolini's hand, but Mussolini clearly wanted to keep on Hitler's good side because he didn't have any other friends in Europe, right? He antagonized, the British and French tried to bring Mussolini into an alliance against Hitler with a little remembered Stresa front from 1935. Mussolini stopped Hitler from annexing Austria, which he tried to do already in 1934. There was an attempted Anschluss before the successful one. There was a failed one, and Mussolini pretty much stopped that. So they were not besties from the beginning. But by the time they became besties, owing to the Ethiopian War and then the Spanish Civil War, Hitler was the only friend Mussolini had, really. And vice versa. So I think it's understood that there was a deeper pressure, if unspoken pressure, to adopt these anti-Semitic laws. Before that, Mussolini had not promulgated much anti-Semitism at all. And when this is really interesting, when the Italian fascists start saying, okay, we're going to be anti-Semitic now, where do they go to justify their sudden about face? The traditions of the Catholic Church. So when Mussolini starts coming up with 1938 anti-Semitic laws that match the Nuremberg laws of Germany, they go, David Kurtzer's very good book on Mussolini and the Pope talks about this at length. They go to the Catholic Church and say, hey guys, do you have our backs? And the Catholic Church basically says yes, because you're reminding your audience, aren't you, that this is just how the Catholic Church had always been teaching on the Jews who refused to recognize that Jesus was the Son of God, and to this day refused to do so, and for that reason are today responsible for the death of Christ. Right? Living Jews responsible for the death of Christ, taught the Catholic Church right up until the Second Vatican Council, right? John the 23rd, with his famous Nostra Aetate, finally said, hey guys, let's stop blaming living Jews for the death of Christ. So that's very much part of the ecosystem, but fascism in Italy had not had much of a anti-Semitic component to it compared to other European countries at the time. It was probably less anti-Semitic, in fact, than most countries, less anti-Semitic than France, that's for sure. So Germany's anti-Semitism is, I think, a different one because there's a racialism to it, right? Spain's Franco might have been an anti-Semite, but there was what was missing from Spanish fascism, at least regarding anti-Semitism, was the eugenic dimension. Italian fascists, interestingly, also didn't have the kind of eugenics or euthanasia that German fascists had, right? Italian fascists were not killing so-called life unworthy of life like German fascists were. So I think that dimension plays a role as well.
And so in the end, what Americans sort of, maybe not learn, but how Americans end up being anti-Semitic, because they've been anti-Semitic and anti-Catholic for a while now. There are regions that are even anti-Lutheran. There are obviously regions that are, anti-immigrant, anti-Black, whatever.
Sure.
But what's interesting about the United States, I think you're getting at, is the United States, depending on the region you're in, it has this eugenics aspect. It has this racialized aspect. It has this economic aspect. It has sort of everything. America's sort of a grab bag of anti-Semitism, depending on where you are, I think.
And depending on the leader, there's lots of variation. There's also a lot of variation depending on the leader. So this guy I was mentioning a minute ago, Pele. Who, runs the Silver Shirts, right? He has an incredibly genocidal view of what should happen to Jews in the United States in the late 30s, before Kristallnacht happens. He's calling for American cities to rise up in violent pogroms against Jews all across the country. Now, he is the son of a Methodist pastor. He views himself to be Protestant. I'm not saying, therefore, all Protestants were going to harbor a violent anti-Semitism. What I'm saying is that it's an interesting point of comparison, right? German anti-Semitism is very heavily inflected by a Lutheranism, which doesn't fate the average Lutheran to therefore be an anti-Semite against their own will. But if you read Luther's tracts, one of the most notorious was called On the Jews and Their Lies. And it wasn't just an angry tweet that Luther shot off and then tried to the next day and hope nobody saw, right? He wrote up his tracts and had them published, right? If he second thoughts, he could always have not published it. And this tract calls for amazing violence. A prior Luther, a couple of decades previously, had said, hey Jews, guess what? The Catholic Church was mean to you. I'm nice. You can feel free to convert to Christianity knowing that I love you, unlike the Catholic Church, which, oh my gosh, I get it. They were so mean to you. How could they have done that? How could they have done that to you? The Inquisition, and well, that's around the same before the Crusades, right? The Crusaders on their way to Jerusalem were slaughtering Jews in Europe. And so Luther says, hey, I get it. You don't trust the Catholic Church. Look at me. I've broken away from the Catholic Church. So hey, join the family now. And when Europe said, thank you, Luther, we'd like to stay Jewish, if that's okay with you. If you don't mind, we'd like to continue to be who we are. Then Luther was outraged, right? So he had a philo-Semitic stage, in other words, that was very conditional. And if he didn't get the return on investment, which was them stopping being Jews and converting to Christianity, then he unleashed an incredibly vituperative anti-Semitism in that tract.
Wow.
So, yeah.
I'm sorry, Rachel, for interrupting, but I do have to ask one more question. So we were talking about anti-Semitism in the United States, but one thing that one of the audience asked, I think maybe Rachel was going to ask this question. She was interested in this, I don't know how to pronounce her name, I apologize. I think her last name is Miss Katonga. But basically she asked about, yes, based on your understanding of how fascists were sort of defeated in the interwar period, I know it took a whole war and stuff, but what do you I know as historians, we can't really have a crystal ball, but what do you think about what current people in the United States, in wherever they're living, if they are dealing with a fascist creep in their country, how they should deal with the fascist creep? What lessons from history do you sort of gain when it comes to dealing with fascism?
No, and I know Ndindi, so hi there, thanks for your question. I think it's an excellent question, and by way of historical comparison, a lot of, in 2016, a lot of people were rueing the divide, right, between Bernie people and Hillary people, right?
Yeah.
And probably in ways that were actually overstating the case in terms of numerical, how many people who had voted for Bernie in the primaries then said, screw it, I'm voting third party, or I'm going to vote for Trump in the generals, is probably overdone, right? But it created a lot of heat. And there was a lot of discussion about how, the Bernie followers were going to just peace out. We didn't get who we wanted, so we're going to take our ball and go home. And this was then, there was a great amount after the election of sort of argument, right? There's sort of a family bickering between Democrats and social democrats about, hey, if Bernie had been the nominee instead of Hillary, he would have won the election, right? This kind of thing. So recrimination, right? Reproach. And a lot of people in that cycle made comparisons with 1932 in Germany, right? The last year of free elections before Hitler comes to power in January of 33, between the Social Democrats of Germany and the Communist Party of Germany, which accused the Social Democrats of being social fascists because they had sold out, right? They had become too moderate. The Social Democratic Party of Germany had become too moderate, et cetera, et cetera. That's a different kind of social democracy than what you get in this country today, which calls itself, of course, democratic socialism, right? Bernie calls himself a democratic socialist, not a social democrat. Anyway, to get to your question then, it is oftentimes suggested that had the two leftist parties, the two Marxist parties, the Social Democrats and the Communists, buried the hatchet, gotten together, they could have stopped Hitler from coming to power. That's a counterfactual, which actually is kind of not very convincing when you look at the day-by-day sequence of events that led up to Hitler's appointment, Hindenburg in January of 33. But it's an interesting social argument, right? When are we going to bury the hatchet? When are we going to stop turning the left into a circular firing squad, right, where we shoot at each other? Forward to 1936 in France, and what happens, there's a fascist threat in France, right? There had been an attempted fascist coup in 1934, street violence, which saw a great deal of bloodshed in February of 1934 in the streets of Paris. That led to the formation of a Front Populaire, right, a popular front, led by Léon Blum, who was a social democrat and the first Jewish prime minister of France, interestingly, who had a coalition with communists and liberals, and everybody who said, oh, holy cow, fascism is going to knock on our door if we don't stop it, right? There's an agreement, let's bury the hatchet. It also helped that in the meantime, Stalin had directed communist parties in the West, hey, I know it didn't turn out well in Germany in 1933 with Hitler coming to power. Maybe let's start, fine-tuning our operation, not going after fellow leftists and not, and stopping the circular firing squad. So a directive from Moscow helped nudge French communists towards this reconciliation. And that's what happened, right? And the Vichy regime is different because that's the product of a German invasion, right? They did not win elections. The Vichy regime was not the result of electoral victory, right? They had been defeated at the hands of the Popular Front. What we got last year, I think, was the best thing that could have happened, right? Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders clearly liked each other more on a personal level than Hillary Clinton and Bernie ever did, right? That helped. Personality in politics should not be underestimated. But also I think there was an understanding, well, look, if we don't get over this, Trump's going to win another 4 years, right? This is aside from the question of whether Trump is a fascist or not. So I think we decided, let's do the right thing this time, and the results are there. And of course, Biden is now, from many points of view, according to many people, he's trying to enact a progressive social democratic agenda. It doesn't help that we have a couple of Democratic senators, right? Arizona and West Virginia, who seem to be siding with the Republicans on a lot of issues. So if they weren't, I think we'd be much further along already. So that's another contingency of history, of course. But I think we're doing the right thing now. To make a long answer short, I think we're doing the right thing now. And from many people's point of view, Bernie is having an impact. There's a sort of a Bernification of Congress. Now, a district just north of me in Cleveland saw the defeat of a Bernie ally at the hands of sort of a moderate Democrat, you could say, in a primary runoff. And that had a lot of national politicians involved in that. So we'll see what ultimately happens. But cautiously optimistic, I think the congressional Democrats are, I think, understanding the necessity of moving to the left on many issues.
Yeah. And I don't, it's not even just about moving to the left. I think what's interesting about the 2020 primary compared to 2016 is as these candidates were dropping out, they were not just significantly to the left of even where Bernie was in 2016, but they were significantly more aware of the dangers of what happens when you don't attempt to even try to listen to the American populace, right? I think most of the candidates, including Joe Biden, regardless of how Joe Biden is governing right now, we're listening to the anger of the 2018 midterms where like so many people came out to vote for Democrats specifically because of healthcare. So many people came out to vote for Democrats specifically because they dislike the tax bill, right? And so I think that's what's interesting about the question that we got asked is, I think the best way to deal with the fascist creep, so it is to really recognize it. But I'm gonna let Rachel ask her question before I ask a last audience question.
Sure.
Yeah, well, there's a tradition on our show of asking about using popular media in your teaching, in your work. And you can tell that our audience is on the same wavelength because there've been a few questions about the occult and neo-paganism or paganism within the Third Reich, but also the association that a lot of popular culture gives it to movies. And of course, Benson here uses Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, and other movies like that. Do you use any of those, or does your class come in sort of like, hey, I know all about Nazis. I've seen it.
Well, so guys,
I've seen The Sound of Music.
Right.
I have an unfortunate encounter that I use. I ended up on the History Channel in ways that had me totally, they totally did a number on me.
Oh no!
They do that.
After my book came out, they asked me this is my entree when I use popular culture. Hey guys, your professor ended up on the History Channel, and they're like, oh, okay, I guess I'll take notes now. I'll pay attention now. Get on GroupMe, but maybe I'll wait 5 minutes. And but it's very embarrassing because, and friends who are listening to me now are like, oh, Richard, you're telling that story again, aren't you? So they were like, this was a couple of years after my book came out, and they were like, hey, we're the History Channel. Do you want to be on a show about Hitler? And it's the History Channel. I mean, half of their content is that, right? And so they said, we'll fly you out to California. Here's a list of questions already ahead of time that we're going to ask you. And they seemed all legit. So I went out there, had a nice weekend. They gave me some pocket money, like, hey, hit Venice Beach, which I duly did. And I wasn't wearing this, by the way, if you just,
Do you wear a fedora?
Yeah, no, that would have been pretty good. So, so I ended up in a documentary about Nostradamus. It was
what?
No.
completely hoodwinked. Yes, it was about Nostradamus, and they used me as a talking head to, so these guys who believe in, that Quatrain 44 prophesies the arrival of a Hilter or something. Hitler. It doesn't say Hitler. It says Hitler. Maybe, Abraham. Yeah, no, not Abraham. That would be totally perverse. But
But that immediately went in your tenure file, correct? Like you were just like,
no,
yes.
that did not. I was already tenured. With that. But no, so I was like, oh no. So 2 weeks before the airs, they call me and say, oh, we finally figured out what the title will be, The Nostradamus Effect. I never said the word Nostradamus once on this damn show. There was no word Nostradamus. So then I'm like, oh great, what do I do now? So I had to tell my students, hey, guess what, guys? Turns out I'm being punked. And what you're going to see in 2 weeks is me getting suckered into being on the show called The Nostradamus Effect. And I never once said the word Nostradamus. So they used me as a talking head to legitimate, right? To make it look like it had its bona fides, scholarly bona fides.
Clearly, we're calling this episode The Nostradamus Effect too, because this time you've said the word Nostradamus.
Yeah, no, sorry, yeah, no, I'll move from that horrible word. But no, I mean, like 10 years later, I was getting emails from former students saying, hey, guess who I saw when I was waiting in the dentist's office? So what am I getting at here? To, these popular misconceptions, I've got that covered. So who needs Indiana Jones? But to be serious for a moment, of course, there's still a very high public demand to be told that Nazism was about the occult. Nazism was about secret societies. Oh, weren't the Masons, Nazism and Masonry? That's a thing, right? They learn their history. The Nazis were anti-Mason. The Nazis were anti-Mason. There's no Masonic element. There's no Illuminati here. So people want Nazism to be about esoterica. They want Hitler to have secretly fled Berlin at the end of World War II and ended up in Antarctica, literally chilling until the moment was right for him to come back, right? So this whole genre, this popular culture obsession, you guys may know the movie, and if you're really bored on a Friday night and don't have anything better on Netflix, you could even watch it, Boys from Brazil. You guys may have heard of this terrible movie from the 1970s, which has excellent actors in it. Gregory Peck, James Mason, Laurence Olivier is playing basically Simon Wiesenthal. And it's about 94 Hitlers having been reproduced and spread all over the world so that they would crop up all over the world. And then it's like, we must hunt them down and kill them while they're teenagers, right? It's just the most absurd nonsense. But it taps into this deep popular cultural obsession that what Nazism must be about, legitimate scholars and legitimate outlets, they haven't told us yet.
Yeah.
They haven't told us yet, right? This is the people who love QAnon, what will they believe? They're smarter than you, right? Conspiracy theory is attractive because the people who believe in conspiracy theory think that they've learned something that you sheeple, you haven't been told yet, right? So because I'm an academic historian, right? I'm the establishment. And because people want to believe conspiracy because it makes them feel smarter, they're very willing to continue. Now, I had a kid some years ago, took a class of mine, and he said to me, yeah, my dad reads books about how Hitler is in Antarctica. As though it's, and not like,
it's matter of fact.
Yeah. This was not like, goof reading. He didn't read this like he reads, Archie cartoons or something, right? So it was just crazy. to see how it is that people still want to believe this. So there's this belief still that the Nazis were into the occult. It is true that there was a branch of Nazism. There were some so-called pagans, I call them paganists in my book, who wanted to recreate, ancient Germanic religions and get interested in Wotan and this kind of thing, right? But they represented a very square minority within the Nazi Party. And I'm not trying to make the other Nazis who found this ridiculous somehow therefore seem reasonable. They were disgusting, heinous men, right? Genocidal lunatics. But even they found this laughable, right? So in as much as there's any empiricism, yes, there were some Nazis who wanted to go back to pre-Christian religion and see if they could do something with it, but it was never sanctioned by the Nazi Party. And many of these books, the Nazi official press wouldn't even publish, so.
Yeah. So I have a more serious question, even though we could end on this note, because this is great. Everybody should just go watch the Nostradamus Effect on the History Channel. But one question that I do have is, we were talking a lot about anti-Semitism, about American Catholicism, but one thing that's really present today is the link between American evangelicals and how much they love Israel, but how it hides their anti-Semitism. Does that play into anything about how you're thinking about your future book? Or your future works?
Yeah, no, that's a very important question, and it's part of the ecosystem, right? And this actually gets us back to this point that I was mentioning regarding Luther earlier. The evangelicals' love of Israel is very much predicated on the notion that Jesus doesn't come back to earth in the second coming unless there's conflagration, right? And that conflagration must be in the Middle East. So the love of Israel by the evangelical, it has this ulterior motive, right? This is the same evangelicalism that can lead people like Reverend John Hagee. You guys might recall in 2008, for just a few weeks, John McCain hired this guy, or at least brought on this guy, John Hagee, to be his sort of like his semi-official pastor. And he then dropped, to his credit, he dropped Hagee like a hot potato once Hagee's preaching surfaced online, which included the belief that Hitler was sent by God to shepherd the Jews out of Europe to Israel, where they belonged. For the second coming to happen, the Jews have to be in Israel, and they have to be at war with their neighbors, and then Jesus returns, and the Jews recognize that they should have been Christian all along, and make up for lost time by saying, oh, okay, finally we recognize, yes, Jesus is the Messiah. So this is not a love of Jews, right? I mean, the evangelical love of Israel is, I'm sorry to say, sort of a shark's love of blood. It's very, it has nothing to do with loving or accepting Jews as such, right? These same people who love Israel will tell you, oh, no, Jews don't recognize Jesus as the Son of God, they're going to go to hell, right? And more to the point, to make this coming happen, there needs to be a conflagration, right? There needs to be conflict in the Middle East. So they're happy to see Jews and Muslims, Arabs, and Israelis go at it, right? It serves their theological purpose.
Yeah.
So which is likened to Luther, right? Luther claims, hey, I love you guys. What do you mean you want to be you? I was loving you so that you would recognize that you should be Christian now. What is this? You want to stay Jewish? No, that wasn't the deal, right? So this love is always very conditional. And so I think that sort of this sort of Christian Zionism, Varsha, as it's called, that you're referring to, is a very conditional attitude towards Jews that is positive only in the most superficial way, right? So they loved the embassy, the American embassy, moving to Jerusalem under Trump, right? They thought that was great. If it antagonized people in the region, great, that serves the purpose.
Yeah. So I was just going to say. Go ahead.
Sorry. No, I was just going to say that this is, of course, part of the ecosystem in 2020, 2021, when you were looking at the people who were most adamantly sticking by Trump, right? There was this hope that some evangelicals would peel away, and maybe anecdotally, one or two more prominent people said, hey, we must recognize that Trump is a false prophet, right? There were people on the other side who were complaining about Trumpism all along, who were suggesting that somehow evangelicals were viewing Trump as a new Jesus and didn't understand their own religion properly. And they view Trump as a substitute for Jesus. They worship Trump, not Jesus. And that became an easy explanation, right, for saying, okay, we don't have to worry about evangelicals anymore because they don't understand Christianity properly.
But that's not true.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
That's the reason I asked the question. Yeah, mainly because what I found interesting in all my research about American fascism, and after reading, your article on it, is that that's what's really important about comparative fascism, and that's how you get out of the Twitter debates, and you're able to block those people online, is because you're able to just understand and tell yourself fascism in general is different in every country. Just as you said, it's not an international movement. It's like inherently different in every country because it's like it has its own national story because it's so based on nationalism. And for the longest time, the story of evangelicalism, of the extreme right, and of right-wing politics and its connection to religion cannot be separated from our story of anti-Semitism, of our story of racism, and ultimately of our story of distinctly American fascism. So that's why I asked the question. Yeah.
Now it's important to keep in mind as well, even as fascists denied there's a family resemblance, look, liberalism is a word we can use to describe these politicians in Berlin, these politicians in London, these politicians in Sao Paulo or Brasilia, and these politicians in Washington, D.C. There's a family resemblance, even as, of course, liberalism in all those 4 countries will look different, right? There will be differences, but there are enough similarities that we still use the L word in all these cases, right? So there's a family resemblance. Socialism in 10 countries will each look different, but there's enough in common that we decide to use that word. So it's a very odd thing when people want to deny the utility of fascism as a category of analysis in the American context by saying, oh, it's European. It has no relevance. It has no salience in American historiography. Well, liberalism also was articulated by plenty of Europeans, and we don't call liberalism in this country a European ideology. Right?
It came from Europe. Like nationalism came from Europe. Right. So much, our whole country came from Europe. So that's,
Well, no, I understand the way in which you meant that. But the point is, socialism too, right?
Yeah.
Eugene Debs, American politician. Don't tell me, therefore, that he's being European. Don't tell me that Bernie Sanders is being European by articulating a vision of democratic socialism for the United States, right?
So that's all the time we have. Yeah.
Okay.
We do need to end, but thank you so much, Richard, and thank Gerald for us. It was very entertaining as well.
The history of my background meant that he would come in as a ghost and then disappear. So,
very Cheshire Cat-like, yes.
Thank you guys very much for having me. I had a great time.
This was great. I learned so much. Thanks so much, Richard.
You're welcome. Cheers.
Cheers.